Have you ever wondered what made the Roaring Twenties, well, roar? Since learning about this decade in school and documentaries, I've been curious about the nickname. So, what did give these 10 years such a bold name? In David W. Brown's article, he says every aspect of life was in some way influenced by that title year. In my presentation today, I'd like to inform you about a few of the many historical events and movements that helped to shape the 1920s. Beginning with the Palmer Red Raids and Prohibition to a sort of revolution in art and entertainment, massive social changes, and ending with the stock market crash. This decade, if nothing else, roared of great change. With World War I freshly behind them, there was a lot of paranoia of communists and terrorists amongst our country. The U.S. Department of Justice Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer conducted a series of raids and attempts to arrest communists and anarchists and radical leftists in our country. He organized these raids alongside J. Edgar Hoover, who also helped him to establish the FBI. Just 2 days into the Golden Era, the most spectacular of raids, as said by Britannica, took place when between 3,000 and 10,000 people were arrested in over 30 cities. The number of arrests greatly exceeded the number of warrants obtained, and most of those accused were innocent. Subsequently, America was in an uproar. One paper even claimed the raids to be an act of terrorism, the very thing they were trying to eliminate. Subsequently, Palmer was removed from his position, and J. Edgar Hoover went on to be the director of the FBI, the first director of the FBI, reigning for almost 50 years. 2 weeks after that massive raid, the 18th Amendment was put into full effect. According to Professor Mark Thornton of Auburn University, the goal was to eliminate and reduce crimes and violent acts caused by the use of alcohol, but it had adverse effects. In fact, over the next year, crime rates rose 24%. Speakeasies, or underground bars and clubs, emerged by the plenty. They were the social scene, boasting booze, jazz and dance, and the famous flapper girls. The problem arose not with the alcohol itself, but with the yearning for control and power and the money that came with it. And so, the American gangster came as well. One of the most well-known gangsters who profited off of these speakeasies and alcohol smugglings, known as bootleggings, was Mr. Al Capone, as mentioned by H. Parker in the National Archives. He made millions yearly and was able to get away with it through generous payoffs to the right government officials. Prohibition surpassed the 1920s, ending in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. And if speakeasies did anything right, it was to help spread the music. And the music of that era was jazz. In fact, the 1920s is also known as the Jazz Era. Dances like the Charleston and the Foxtrot, and musicians like Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, and Duke Ellington emerged from this era. Even though segregation was prominent in our society still, jazz also helped break some of the barriers by allowing and showcasing African American musicians in all-white clubs and bars. Along with the art of jazz, literary art had a revolution of its own via the Harlem Renaissance. Digital history reads, the movement for Black pride found its expression via the Harlem Renaissance. It also says, the Harlem Renaissance was the first literary and art movement in Black American history. The Harlem Renaissance produced great literary figures known today, such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. Just as the arts had massive changes, there were massive and profound social changes as well. In November 1920, the first radio broadcast was sent out across America with news about the presidential election. Within a couple years, radios were in most homes, and people flocked to them, bringing families closer together. Advertising companies were created as well, which meant commercials were created and reached the masses. Mass demand meant mass production, and so commercialism began. Henry T. Ford mastered this production with his assembly line in his Model T car. The assembly line made cars more accessible, which meant more jobs, more demands for roads, and a greater sense of freedom. The desire for freedom was prevalent in the fashion shift. The 19th Amendment, also known as the ending of women's suffrage, happened shortly into the year of 1920. This brought upon a great sense of independence and a feeling of empowerment. Women started wearing their hair shorter with bobs and short dresses, and started to move towards a more risque fashion away from the conservative one. This also paved the way for women to obtain blue-collar jobs, rather than having to conform to the housewife life. Women were ready to be seen and heard. The 1920s was known to be exciting and loud and busy, but all good things must come to an end eventually. The Roaring Twenties ended with a bang, or a crash, I should say. I'm referring to the Great Stock Market Crash. This is known as the Wall Street Crash of 1929. According to History.com, the stock market peaked on September 23rd of 1929, but on October 28th, it plummeted, sending people into a panic. They started pulling their stocks and trading stocks left and right. It was too much for the system to sustain, and on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed, putting America into some severe debt. This, along with other economic forces, started the Great Depression, thus ending the 1920s. So what did make the 1920s roar? With the research given today, you now have an idea. These events are just a glimpse of all that happened in this great and busy decade. With the 5 points presented today, I hope to have given you at least that, a glimpse into what made the 1920s roar.